This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, you guys. My name is Risa Shimoda. I'm the Executive Director of the River Management Society, and welcome you. I think we'll see a few more people trickle in as as our time goes forward. But I wanted to thank you so much for joining us for, as you can read, fostering respect for Indigenous cultural river uses, acknowledgement and reciprocity in action. That's a lot of letters. Um, but it's kind of appropriate because it reflects kind of the complexity of a topic that kind of seems really simple and is really not simple. So thanks for joining us today, and it's great to have you here at the River Management Society's River Management Roundtable.
Hey everyone, my name is Becca Price and I'm the Communications Coordinator for the River Management Society. If you're not familiar with what we do or you're not a member of RMS, we are a national nonprofit organization that supports professionals who study, protect, and manage rivers. Throughout the year, we host a variety of workshops and opportunities to collaborate, as well as connecting members through river trips, our listserv, and our directory. We host these river management roundtables twice monthly, and we welcome everyone that works on and for rivers. On the second Tuesday of the month, we explore on the river topics which pertain to more technical aspects of river management. And then on the fourth Tuesday, which is the one we're in today, we cover workplace culture topics. If there are topics that you would like us to explore in future roundtables, please let us know. Or if you're interested in presenting, we would love to hear from you.
And hi, everyone. Angie Furman here, the River Training Center Coordinator from River Management Society. And just wanted to share with everyone just some group norms for today as we're going through. We're going to have a presentation from Jen Rice, and then we're going to have some time for questions at the end. So we're just asking that everyone be respectful of one another, but also contribute to the process, ask those questions, but then also make room for space, make space for others to ask questions as well.
All right, well, you have heard from our team, and we will hand it over now to our wonderful and lovely presenter, Jen Rice, to introduce herself and take over.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. I'm honored to get to be with you today in this space and really want to thank the River Management Society for spending so much time helping me tailor the conversation with you today to really meet your needs, hopefully. And I really want to give a shout out to Sarah Hoagland and Becca Price for their roundtable about context and practice of statements of acknowledgement, and Craig Tucker for his dive into the Klamath dam removal process. Both of those roundtables are kind of setting up some context for this conversation today. And you can go to the next slide. What I want to do today is really, I think this work for me is, I think as Craig Tucker put in his own way, it's about becoming a better human all the time, the constant practice. And today I'll explore, opportunities to build relationships and trust with Indigenous cultural river users, and also strive in the constant kind of practice to understand how to improve their experiences with particularly recreational users. So opening the door into this conversation, we'll touch on what we mean by traditional cultural river uses, what an ideal future might look like, and what these concepts of acknowledgement and reciprocity really mean. Share some management considerations and examples, and what potential first little baby steps and possibilities, big, juicy, dreaming possibilities might look like. And the the best part for me is I want to get into your experiences and your knowledge. And you can go to the next slide. Before I start, I want to give my own acknowledgement to, I just pray that I am doing justice to the many native, mentors who have spent countless hours investing in me and my knowledge, and for bringing their millennia of knowledge and practice of being river keepers to my life and my practice. And I also really want to thank the Native nations where I live, the Wiyot tribe, and play a lot. And here in Northwestern California, the Karuk, Yurok, Sinangwe, Talawadeni, Hupa, in particular, and their territories. And I encourage, for those of you who haven't, to build a better understanding of the traditional territories where you live and play. I also need to give a very strong caveat that as a non-native white lady and a private boater's perspective, that's the context that I'm coming to you from today. And my perspective is that understanding native cultural practices is pretty much impossible for non-native people to really fully grasp. And so I'm on a lifelong journey to learn, and I'm going to share a little bit with you today, but it's in that context of that I am a non-native person and lack most of the knowledge necessary to really understand these concepts. And you can go to the next slide. So you're probably wondering, like, well, so why is this gal talking to us today? If she's not a river manager and not an outfitter, I do come to you with the perspective of having a degree in resource management, even though I'm not a river manager. And I also I've spent most of my life around guides and outfitters and as a private boater on Western rivers. And I was also raised with respect of Native culture and have spent the last 20 years working with Native communities, particularly the last 10, where I was responsible for a statewide Native cultural revitalization program and co-founded a now Native-led community organizing network in this region. And I think just my career has been doing that kind of work, bringing lots of organizations and communities and leaders together to solve or grapple with wicked problems together. But now I'm in grad school, hence I don't really have a title right now. So you can go to the next slide. So this ideal future of what does respect look like? And what do we need to change in order to get there? I think the moral of the story is that we all just have to ask, because that answer is going to be different with every Native person and every tribe. And when I've been asking that question, I get a range of responses, and here's a couple of examples. One is, I think, representative of many perspectives, this idea that we just want acknowledgement of who we are and our traditions. And that this is a fundamental, I think, concept that we'll dig into in a bit here. Then there's specific ideas that came up. For those of you who aren't aware that statistically speaking, Native communities experience as much or more violence at the hands of law enforcement than as Black communities do. And so this cultural leader shared that, remember that more law enforcement on a river for us is not the answer. So we don't need more, he said, river cops. We need cultural education. Maybe we could have a cultural ranger who's sharing about culture and ecology and hydrology on the river. So just some ideas. You can go to the next slide. So I'm throwing this word culture around, but we need to dig into what it means, because it is a very different meaning than I think the term that we're used to using, especially the concept of river culture or recreational river culture. I think users landed on rivers where there are 10 to 14,000 years of cultural context that we are usually not aware of, and our educational systems don't really help us understand that. This is a concept that is really complex, and as I mentioned earlier, I don't think it's fully knowable by non-native folks, but I try. I do my best to understand. It's a very holistic, rich, and deep concept, and my understanding is it's really embodied by interconnected practices and the way you walk and hold yourself in the world and in your relationships. There are some obvious elements of cultural practices that I think are easier for managers to manage around, like ceremonies or dances and observance of language. Subtle practices, like I was mentioning earlier, are maybe things for us to start to learn about how to interact with Native communities, how we relate, what those responsibilities are for holding relationships and interactions. And I think we can go to the next slide. So some examples of cultural uses are more obvious ones: managing habitats and gathering and harvesting, traditional foods and materials for tools, and ceremonial regalia. And regalia, as far as I know, and a lot of the examples I'm giving are representative of this region in Northwestern California. Regalia is considered, I think, pretty much like a sacred being. So you can go to the next slide. Actually, hold here for a moment. That picture is of Ron Reed, who's a Karuk elder and cultural leader, and he's the one who asked me for help with this awareness building of cultural practices on the Klamath River. And so it's to him I owe this opportunity to speak to this topic. And then the next slide. Some other examples are multi-day meditative preparation for ceremony. And I'll just share briefly that a friend called me a few years ago in a crisis where his kids were accosted by several different law enforcement officers in a very remote place, hours off of the nearest 2-lane highway. That highway, by the way, I've been spending time on the Klamath River for 33 years, and I've never seen a law enforcement officer except once. So anyway, there was a hunter who called law enforcement and said, there are illegal immigrants here in the forest, you need to come. And they came with heavily armed and handcuffed these 2 kids who were in solitary ceremonial preparation. So there's an example of massive disrespect that was incredibly traumatic to that community. There's a wide range of purposes and types of ceremonies, and those are, again, an obvious practice. I just want to note here that I'm using historic photos because ceremonies are not places where non-native people can or should be expected to be able to attend or observe. It's incredibly special if you ever are invited, and photos are a big no-no. So I'm not sharing current photos of ceremony here today. And then just the spaces to maintain and teach traditional ecological knowledge, of which we'll all be better for better understanding of. You can go to the next slide. We'll drill into examples of preserving sacred sites and observing them and acknowledging and managing around them today. These are pictures of the Klamath River, and on the Klamath, most of the traditional village sites were wiped out by miners. So there are very difficult histories around some of these sites, but every Native person I know in this region introduces themselves in the context of those ancestral villages. So they're very important contemporary sites and sites where people live near today. And again, if there's anybody I would trust to use fire appropriately, it's Native people. And there are lots of examples of Native people being accosted for ceremonial use of fire on barren river bars where there should be no issue. I would love it if you have other examples, folks, to just share them in the chat. And that goes for any thoughts where you can add to this conversation. I'm going to zoom through, this presentation, and then I really want to get to a conversation of sharing at the end. You can go to the next slide. So I believe that respect of traditional practices benefits all of us, and you really can't extricate these traditions that are interwoven with millennia of management of ecosystems on this continent. They're inextricable. And a lot of ceremonial purposes are this concept of here called world renewal ceremonies, but I think many ceremonies have this concept of caring for all of us, planet and people, doing a big job, a big lift. For those of you unfamiliar with the concept of targeted universalism, there are links for everything that I'm referring to today at the end and on a resources slide, and you'll have access to the PDF. But this is one of my favorite concepts for managers to understand, that specifically managing for those most vulnerable will automatically take care of the rest of us. So a really easy example of that is curb cuts on sidewalks. Before they existed, moms with strollers and folks in wheelchairs, good luck to you. Now that they exist on most sidewalks, not only is it much safer for moms with strollers, but it made it easier for my grandma to get around when she started having trouble walking. So I encourage you all to look more into this concept of targeted universalism. And then there's an increasing body of scholarship that improving cultural identity and access to practice cultural identity for Native communities increases health and well-being. And I also want to mention that I provided an example here from probably the most quoted document of all my Native peers is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And there's a link to that at the end of this deck as well. You can go to the next slide. So for me, this is a journey, a continuum of building little baby step practices. And I'm sure many of you who work with Native communities know this: building trust and relationships is paramount to being able to get to the big, dreamy possibilities. And for me, those possibilities are Native management of lands and rivers, returning land to tribes. And this photo is an example of a current bill that our Congressman Huffman has introduced to return this particular site, which is considered the center of the earth, to the Kaduk tribe. And that's currently being considered. And then the concept of river personhood. I bet a bunch of you river geeks like me are familiar with this movement of the Maori in New Zealand, and some of their attorneys who've worked on establishing river personhood are working with the Yurok tribe here at the mouth of the Klamath. You can go to the next slide. So these kind of first steps of what do management opportunities look like, acknowledgement and action, what does it look like? So sharing information that respects Native existence, needs, and contributions on signs, on websites. Here's an example from the Six Rivers National Forest website. On maps that we'll see in a moment, PSAs, adjusting activities around ceremonial and gathering times and places, reserving or limiting uses of specific areas at times. We'll look at those examples in a moment. You can go to the next slide. Engaging traditional expertise in habitat management. That could be a whole presentation in itself about the benefits of doing that. And as I mentioned a minute ago, trusting and supporting uses of fire. This is an example of a conversation I had with the district ranger on the Six Rivers National Forest, who's responsible for managing the stretch of river around the town of Happy Camp on the Klamath that I spend a lot of time boating on. And he shared that, every year, because ceremonial dates and times change with the moon cycle, they get new information from the tribe every year about those dates, and they put that process through NEPA and release that information to the public and close those sites every year. And we'll look at that in just a moment. You can go to the next slide. So just some ideas about taking first steps toward these management opportunities. If you don't have relationships with Native communities, my encouragement is to start, the bare minimum is to respect that Indigenous folks have a very different experience and reality, and that as non-Native people, I know I need to tell myself regularly that I may think I know, but I don't. And learning the histories that we've never been taught is incredibly important to understand Native perspective. So go find some Native authors and start diving in if you haven't. Really critical is to understand the importance of sovereignty. It's such a fundamental attribute of US history that we are taught so little of, and it's such a critical element of engaging with any tribe. I think the most frequent advice I give when I'm asked by I work a lot with cities and counties and local and regional and state government land managers, is to pause what we think we know. And this is another thing I have to regularly build my own practice of, is that I think, and as an extrovert, it's extra, I have to apply extra intention to pause and listen. And if I think I know it, turn instead to curiosity and openness. And then I'll just note that some of you probably know this, but tribal government representatives have a very different role than cultural leaders and practitioners do. And some Native people wear both of those hats, many do not. So the closest analogy I can give is that it is like the difference between church and state. So it's not one and the same when you're talking to a tribal government. You're not also talking to a cultural leader necessarily, and you have to do that work to find out. You can go to the next slide. Some more ideas about first steps is in management actions, acknowledging Native existence. And I should add, when I say management, also, I just want to be inclusive of the outfitters that are here today and advocates of, this might look different for your practices. And I'll have a few examples in a moment of the information you provide to your guests or to the groups that you advocate alongside, to acknowledge Native existence and deeply rooted history and knowledge, the influence on land and river management, and the contemporary role. I'll give an example of land and river management influence here in this area for the last decade. Tribes and cultural groups have worked really hard to bring the use of fire back to the landscape. And they will all tell you that before settlers got here and non-Native communities started managing these landscapes, there were vastly fewer conifers on these landscapes. They were much more fire adapted, many more hardwoods, and water tables were higher because there were fewer trees. So think about what that means for rivers and salmonids, for instance. So that's just an example. And the contemporary role folks play. And please, again, if you think of ideas or experiences you have, please add them into the chat. And you can go to the next slide. So I'm going to drill into management examples on the lower Klamath River in northwestern California, where I spend a lot of time. And I want to thank Scott Harding, I think, is here today, and I think Will Volpert is as well, from American Whitewater and Indigo Creek Outfitters, who shared their knowledge with me about the fact that there's about 6,000 guests per year on this, I would say, lower middle stretch of the Klamath, that are guests of permittee outfitters. In Oregon, that's about another 5,000 a year, just to give you a concept of the level of use. There is no public permit system, or therefore use numbers that I know of. So, but my experience has been that public use of the river has been steadily rising, especially in the last decade. And just from talking to managers and outfitters during the pandemic, even much more so. This stretch of river is jointly managed by the Klamath and Six Rivers National Forests. There's one river ranger that just got an award, I understand. I have never run into a river ranger. I don't think most of the boaters I know, most of us thought there was none. So, and I will tell you that the land managers I've talked to, these forests have been so heavily stripped of resources that for this stretch of river that I run, the only staff other than the ranger that I've never seen, who, I'm not saying they're not there, it's just probably they have a huge stretch of river to cover. But the only other staff out there is like a maintenance worker, cleaning bathrooms and tending at campsites. So there's really almost no capacity for managing these stretches of rivers and river users. So you can go to the next slide. The Karuk territory depicted there is ancestral territory. This is one of many tribes who were shafted out of a treaty and got no land. They're the second biggest tribe in California. Little known fact that the state of California has the largest population of Native residents. And there are several of the three biggest tribes in California are actually in this watershed. And we're lucky here that this region was too rugged for settlers to be able to demolish these communities. So there's a very intact cultural identity and practice among these tribes, and so there are many other tribes in this watershed and reservations. We'll spend a moment on this Code of Federal Regulations that allows for sacred sites closure. You can go to the next slide. This regulatory support for cultural practice allows for privacy for traditional and cultural purposes. This closure of sites must be requested by tribes. So for example, on the Trinity River, one of the biggest tributaries to the Klamath, that has, as far as I know, a much, much, much higher level of day use of whitewater users, that tribe in that area, the Sonungwe, is not federally recognized. So they have no way to seek this protection. And I will just say, of the 182, I think, tribes in California, there are at least a dozen that are not federally recognized. And I would advocate for even more attention, like that whole targeted universal concept, paid to and given to non-federally recognized tribes to support them. So these closures, are subject to approval by the Forest Service, temporary and smallest practicable area. So in most of these cases we're looking at their river bar sites. And you can go to the next slide. So this is what this looks like on the Klamath National Forest website, of alerting river users to acknowledgement of tribal existence, culture, activity, and the next slide shows specific maps that help river users, you can go to the next slide, know which sites are going to be closed for ceremonial purposes on which dates. I did not know any of this existed as a 33-year user of the Klamath River. And this has only been in recent years that the Klamath National Forest and Six Rivers National Forest, thankfully, have started to provide this information and this service to the tribes of closure. You can go to the next slide. Thanks to the Salmon River Restoration Council for providing these examples of interpretive signage that isn't yet installed on the Salmon River, that are, I think, a great example of helping river users start to understand this element of their river experience as a standard part of their river experience, and to start to build in their understanding of how to plan this into trips and dates and sites that river trips will be impacting. You can go to the next slide. Because I think really that's this thread that runs through all of the perspectives that I've heard, is that we need more information in the trip planning stage to help river users understand how to anticipate engagement with tribal activities and cultural activities. So American Whitewater I want to hold up as doing an incredible job of this work. And they're, given the fact that, their work is often to help make sure that that river access is open, they're doing such a strong work, I think, respecting traditional culture, that this is a rare scenario where they're actually dissuading boaters from accessing really sensitive sites. And if you go to the next slide, you can see an example of their online maps, where at the bottom of this slide is a really sensitive piece of river that is also very popular it's like class 6 portage that you actually saw a picture of Ron fishing on earlier, right? Did I? Yeah. That they don't even provide information about that stretch of river anymore because it is such a sensitive site. And I just want to give them props for providing information on their homepage last month. The next slide is getting into some outfitters, acknowledgement and action on their websites. In this example, I think I looked at about a dozen outfitters' websites, and this was the one example where really an excellent job alerting guests to the presence of Native communities and cultural activities, and the potential for adapting trip itinerary around ceremonial activities. The next slide is an example of outfitters working with land managers in the run-up to the removal of the Klamath dams. They're working to learn about and advocate for new river access sites that reduce the amount of impact on important cultural sites. And you can go to the next slide. So thanks to Will and Scott and Redwoods and Rivers for your work there. So to start to wind down a little bit here, I want to give a shout out to California State Parks, who I think is a leader in a movement that we'll see more of in the future, where Native site names will start to be respected as even taking the place of, in this instance, about 20 miles up the road from my house, what was called Patrick's Point State Park is now called Sumeg State Park. And Scott Harding provided me a couple of images that are examples of Native folks being frustrated with the lack of Native site names in places. You can go to the next slide. I also wanted to provide a little bit of a dive into this concept of reciprocity in action. And what is this concept? I think for most of us professionals and non-Native folks, it's easy to not understand the cost that Native folks have incurred for maintaining the knowledge that they have. That in many cases, this knowledge was illegal and it was maintained at great human cost over many generations. So for me to ask a Native person, can you come to this meeting and tell us what you know, or can you join me out at the site and help me understand? For me, I still have to remind myself that I can't just make that request. I need to offer something to reciprocate. Whether it's, I'll feed you lunch, or especially to offer my time and effort in exchange, my information, follow up on requests, access to places and people, connections to your network, changes in policy and procedure. I should have put that in bold and underlined, is really important. And I'll get into more about providing funding, but before I do, I just want to acknowledge that I'm doing this because Ron asked, and he waved me over to the side of the river and said, some people said I should, wait till your boat came by and ask you for help, because I've been standing here all day asking boaters to respect the signs that say quiet zone, because I would rather be teaching my grandkids ceremony than standing here asking for respect. And I was so grateful for the gift of being asked for help. This gave me an opportunity to give back for all the benefit I have received from the Klamath River and the Karuk community. So hats off to Ron. On the next slide, let's talk a little bit about reducing bureaucracy. For all of you government staff out there, I know this is going to sound a little impossible. I've just come out of a decade of working for a foundation where long before I got there, shifted their practice to making grants to individuals. I know this sounds impossible for those of you who know it's not usually deemed legal, but for Native communities, we made grants to individuals without requirements. This could be a whole nother topic of presentation about how to, I think, repair damage done by extracting assets out of Native communities and turning that into monetary assets for settlers and their descendants. But even, I think, more probably for this space, it's sole source contracts. Giving contracts for Native folks' time and expertise that remove every possible bit of, I'll say, white culture control, which is very traumatizing to put Native people through. Our ideas of how to control through contracting. And, if that's too difficult, give honoraria for their expertise and stipends for participation in meetings and travel costs. And always make sure that Native folks retain intellectual property rights and use rights to whatever they produce for you. So wrapping up, I wanted to share an example of some Native River outfitters and a life-changing experience to get in I think it's a half a redwood dugout at the mouth of the Klamath. The Yurok tribe is both the agency and the outfitter, offering dugout tours that I can't encourage folks to plan into your visits to the behind the redwood curtain enough. There's also jet boat tours. You can hire Native fishing guides, and the tribe also provides jet boat transport to particularly Native residents who need to travel in really rugged territory where there aren't roads. You can go to the next slide. Before I finish, I just want to say that in the PDF you'll have access to, there are lots of linked resources here, everything I've referenced today. and some opportunities if you need help in bringing this kind of thinking to your teammates or want to seek consulting help. There are some links here to some reading and some opportunities to get help. And my email address, if you know of other folks doing this kind of work, I'd love to hear about it. The next slide is just, again, some acknowledgements on my part of my Native mentors. You can go to the next slide. Just to, the many folks who've invested in my knowledge, and the River Management Society for creating this space to share and discuss today and learn from each other. And the folks who really helped me learn, this is something I knew really almost nothing about, and still probably relative to many of you here today, don't know much about. And let's dig in. I would love to hear from folks here today. On the next slide, what are your experiences? What are you learning about respecting Native culture and practices? What are you learning, trying, observing? And what have you taken from this conversation today to try out and take those little steps yourselves? So first, I want to hold some space for any Native participants who are here today who can share, if you're interested, your experiences and your insights. Just acknowledging that I'm sure you know vastly more about this than I do. And so I'll hold some silence for a moment to see if there are any Native folks who want to share with us, either by chat or by unmuting. And for those of you who, want to come off, want to bring your video back on, I'd love to see folks who are here today and hear from you. Please share. Oh yes, Thomas. Please do share. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your experiences.
Yeah, so thank you. Tom O'Keefe, I'm the Northwest Stewardship Director for American Whitewater, and pertinent to today's topic, live and work in lands of the Coast Salish people. And just a couple of observations, and thank you for doing this. I feel like I'm on a similar journey of trying to navigate this space. Just a couple of thoughts. One, you mentioned the Klamath and the information that's out on the closures, and I can tell you as a river user who's been down there but doesn't know the river well at all. Like I've actually only been down on that river, lower river, once. It is really hard to read and understand the materials that the Forest Service puts out. So as a river user who wants to do the right thing, it's really hard to understand. I don't know the names of any of the places or the different river segments or anything, and the language that they use, I feel like it's written more in a regulatory context, and would really benefit from some communications assistance and some river users. So it's something Scott and I have talked about, but that's something to keep in mind. A lot of times, river managers, they kind of think in the context of closure orders and CFRs, and that is very hard for the public to digest. And even for myself who understands this stuff, it's hard to understand. So that's one thing. I appreciate, you referenced acknowledgement and recognitions of presence of Indigenous communities, past, present, and future. I often find it's really hard. Like, we want to do more of that, but finding the right words and ways to express that is always very hard and very difficult. So I just want to, even when there's a desire, like finding the right person to talk to. I appreciate your comment on reciprocity too, and I think that's really important. And that's one of the things I'm learning, is that like I can't just expect someone to, like, okay, what do you want us to write? There has to be some reciprocity there to provide them with the resources and capacity to be able to do that. We've been trying to do that, but it's a lot of work. So it's sometimes not as easy as just like, okay, we're just going to put some on our website now. Finding the right words can be very important. And I've worked with a number of organizations and some that have, made some attempts at this and then written the wrong thing. And then that can sometimes make things worse. So anyway, just a couple of thoughts. Thank you.
Oh, such good stuff, Tom. Thank you so much. And I do want to underscore your point about that it takes time and trust to be able to consult with tribes and cultural leaders to find out how best they want to be represented. And it might take years. Yeah, others, feel free to unmute. Have at it.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. So I live in Gatineau, Quebec, which is across the river from Ottawa, the capital of Canada. And this is the intersection of the Kitchissippi River, or the Ottawa River on the Anglo side. They call it the Outaouais River on the French side, but it's Kitchissippi, which means Great River in Algonquin. And it intersects with the Rideau River and the Gatineau River. And this area is known as a special intersection of rivers where all sorts of magical things happen, where there's the intersection of people, trade. It's found in the archaeological record of the area. But I tell you, with 6 different jurisdictions, on both sides of the river, Quebec, Ontario, Gatineau, Ottawa, and the federal government, and then also there's the local and Algonquin communities that have overlapping interests. It's just a mess of understanding of our residents' access rights, for example. And I've been fighting for 16 years with the city of Gatineau to just replace the dock that they seized from us. They took away all our access rights. And I go down to the city hall to remind them that this is part of our heritage to paddle. And time again, they deny us a simple request, which is just to provide us safe access from in front of our properties on the Ottawa River there. So I don't know. I invited the city to participate in this session. I don't know if they're listening in, but I tell you, it's very frustrating, and we have a long way to go before Indigenous rights are going to be respected here. Hydro-Quebec, for example, they own lands up and down the rivers here, but they've been selling off the lands. Often they do it without consulting the Indigenous community, which is deplorable. So they're selling off the land to private interest groups. And what I would like to see in the long run is that they create a national urban park in the area. But I tell you, the Parks Canada won't even respond to my emails on this after about a decade of my consulting them. So even though we have in Canada this, we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that wrote a report on how we have to respect Indigenous rights more, because in Canada, it is formally recognized that Indigenous people have rights. That to put those rights into practice and demonstrate what we call reconciliation of the two realities of Indigenous rights and settler rights. Until that comes together, we're still in a limbo land, it seems. And I really appreciate this workshop here, or this presentation, because it helps to further the understanding that Indigenous people should be part of these planning, the planning of the rivers. And one of the things you mentioned was that really resonated was what I've been telling them. If you meet our needs to access the river safely, you're going to be meeting the needs of the overall community that also wants to access the river in a safe way too, because there's a expanding interest in paddling, especially during COVID, paddling and rowing and sailing, in addition to the motorboating. And if we can figure a way to balance all those needs out to primarily respect Indigenous rights, but then that will benefit everyone together. So anyway, that's my comment. And I'm really glad to be participating in this today. Good.
Thank you so much, John, for sharing that scenario. And I'm so sorry that you haven't found good partners yet to work with and respect your needs and their opportunities to grow. And a couple things that come to mind is that I think this roundtable will be recorded and on the River Management Society's website. So, feel free to send them the link and encourage them to watch. And I hope that, advocacy organizations like American Whitewater, I think, are increasingly great partners to join with. As an organizer, I also think of like in my previous role at a foundation, when I gave that example of why a Native person called me when their kids were threatened, is because I was in an institution that had power, not relevant necessarily to land management, but I could call up the forest supervisor and say, hey, Humboldt Area Foundation calling here. I heard about this. What's the deal? And I want to encourage all of you to use your power as much as you can in that way. I'm wondering if some of the change in experience that some of these cultural leaders have been having recently is because folks like Scott Harding and myself are getting more involved. And it's unfortunate then, like, when white folks call up, maybe they pay more attention, but hey, use it. I say, put yourself in there and be a partner. I don't really like the word ally so much, but I prefer to think of myself as a partner on a learning journey. And John, I hope you can find some partners who can step into that ring with you. Other thoughts, other folks who haven't shared. I'm sure there are more perspectives, more wisdom, more experiences to share here. Scott, do you want to share anything that you would add to what I shared today? You wear multiple hats in this arena, I know.
Today is the brown hat. Oh boy, there's lots of things we could say, but you gave many examples of the cultural use of fire here on the Klamath, and that's not something that is unique or endemic to the native peoples of the Klamath River. It's occurred throughout this continent, throughout the world, the use of fire. I was speaking with Ron Reed last week, and we were talking about watersheds. Well, watersheds are fire sheds, and we were talking about the river. He referred to it as a fire pathway, and there's really such a deep connection between Native peoples, their way of seeing the world and interacting with it, and their way of managing the natural landscape that depends on fire. And here in this part of North America, also depends upon salmon. And those two things are inexplicably connected to the point where, well, you and I may see a difference, fire and water, but Ron Reed sees no difference. They're one and the same. They depend upon one another. And I think that it's really important that we try to recognize that. And as you alluded to, there are things that we can't understand. And perhaps that's one of them. But what I found in working here in Northwest California and in the Klamath watershed, and particularly, one of the best ways to build a relationship and trust and to show reciprocity with the native folks is to learn their cultural practice, the use of fire, and engage in that with them. That goes leaps and bounds. So I would encourage anybody who's in a position to do that, to do so. And that can be going out for a day if you're given the opportunity. It can be engaging in the Nature Conservancy's prescribed fire training exchange programs and spending a week or two becoming a prescribed fire practitioner. You'll find yourself working hand in hand with Native folks in that program. And it goes just so far towards this culture of respect that I can't recommend it enough.
Thanks so much, Scott. I want to wrap up and I appreciate you bringing more depth and context to my sharing from this region. And I want to wrap up and hand it back to River Management Society with Tom's last point here, which is one of the cultural practitioners I asked early on after Ron asked me for help. She practices on the Salmon River, and there's actually a movie coming out right about now that's called The Long Night of Ladies, about her family and their cultural practices on the salmon, that I can't encourage you to see enough. I think it'll be on Netflix. She said that, the first thing she started with was, how do we teach groups of people who learn how to interact on a river? And she was like, is there a way we can pay tribal representatives to work with outfitters, for instance, like I think Will Volpert shared with me is done on this Idaho Salmon River, to engage with river users and new river guides. I'd love to explore more ways to build it into our structures and systems, that this information is part of the experience on rivers. And I just want to say thanks again to all of you for being here today. Thanks for the conversation. Thanks to the River Management Society for the space.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was awesome. Oh, thanks, Becca. We just want to highlight that our next River Management Roundtable is going to be on Tuesday, April 12th, and we're going to be looking at waterway management and the third edition of the Waterway Management Guide. And we also encourage, as Becca mentioned in the beginning, if you have any topics that you would like us to delve into or that you would like to share more about, please let us know. So we're still filling out our calendar for the year, but we've got some cool talks lined up, but we also have some availability for other talks. And then as a reminder, this is recorded, and we are putting this onto our video channel, so you can find that. It'll probably take about a day for us to get it up there. But then you can share that with partners, or you can go back and watch it. And then I also wanted to share that RMS does have chapter trips, and our Pacific chapter is working on putting a trip together that will be kind of based out of Happy Camp. We've got some Happy Camp, California. We've got some great speakers lined up to kind of delve more into some of these topics, and as well as just looking at the Klamath Dam Removal Project in general. So I really encourage you to check that out. That's going to be held the second week of June. We're going to have more details coming soon. And then lastly, I just want to let everyone know that we do have our RMS Awards nominations open, and that we will be closing the nominations. The deadline is March 30th. So if you know a river manager who's been doing some great work out there, we encourage you to go to the website and nominate them for an RMS award. And Becca put the link there in the chat. And then as always, continue to check out our upcoming trainings and events. We've got everything from wild and scenic webinar series. Also next month, we've got more information coming soon, but a webinar on bank stabilization on wild and scenic rivers. So that will be pretty interesting. And again, feel free to reach out if you have any questions or follow up. And just a huge thank you again to everyone for joining us and for to Jen for her presentation. So it was awesome. And I apologize for some background noise. Well, thanks, everyone.